So one thing that Redshift and every other relational database have in common is best practices related to data types. One thing that you'll find almost every database administrator out there preaching: use data types for the type of data that they are intended. What does this mean? What it means is don't store numbers that are intended for math in varchar columns. Don't store dates in column types that aren't dates. When picking a data type, especially if it's like an integer or a number, use the smallest one possible for the type of data that column's actually going to contain. You don't need a varchar 50 if the longest string that you're going to put into that column is only 4 characters. This seemingly trivial technique can have significant downstream effect when talking billions of rows. A handful of wasted bytes per row can add up to many gigabytes or more of data that the engine must manage and traverse. Now, while we're on the topic of data types, let's talk about implicit conversions. Amazon Redshift does support complex implicit conversions to reduce the amount of code and overhead in moving data around. That doesn't mean it does it without overhead. Now, if you're not familiar with the term implicit conversion, it's when you do something like the following. Consider this query that we have here. Notice how even though you are adding an integer to a varchar, Redshift understands what you are trying to do. As long as what you are trying to do is concatenate a character 10 with an integer that was also converted to a character, you end up with 1010. Were you expecting 10 plus 10 to equal 20? Well, that would require a conversion of the varchar to an integer. Now, many pure languages, such as C#, would throw an error stating that you cannot do math on a character type when combined with an integer. Now, the downside is that it can create unnecessary overhead, which can creep in when table designers start thinking data types don't matter. Not to mention, it creates the possibility for data errors like we may have seen earlier. If you were expecting the concatenation of 2 characters, then it worked out great. If not, it may have caused downstream problems. Just because Redshift is smart enough to figure things out doesn't mean that you should force it to. Now, while I just spent a few minutes telling you to avoid implicit conversions, they can at times really be useful and save your code. If you want to know the choices that Redshift makes when doing implicit conversions, see this post in AWS documentation for information on the order of conversions and what converts to what. And then, once you've done that, commit to yourself that you're going to avoid doing this whenever possible.